Right, hello everyone. We are coming back this week, the week of Thanksgiving, for our next video that we're going to do covering the whole story of the Russian Revolution. Now, last week I kind of was hoping that we would be able to get to the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened in October/November, depending which calendar you're going off of 1917. But upon going through the material, it has kind of come to my attention that it would probably be best suited. There's just so much information to kind of fill the gap in between how do we get from the February-March Revolution with the Tsar being overthrown and a provisional government being set up to that provisional government being overthrown in October, November of that year. There's just so much information that kind of needs to be explained a little bit in between those two that I decided it warranted its own separate video. So for this video, we're going to be going over that summer, the summer of 1917 in Russia, and mostly this is going to show a little bit how inadequate the provisional government was in governing the country and how that kind of builds the momentum and the chance to come up for these radical communist Bolsheviks to seize power from the provisional government. So next week, we will get onto the Bolshevik Revolution. That is guaranteed. But I thought after going through the info, it would make a little bit more sense to delve into a little bit of why did the provisional government fall so easily when that finally came. So for this week, we're going to go over the summer of 1917, which is the lead up to the Bolshevik Revolution, and this is really the time that the provisional government is for once actually in power. So the first thing we want to look at here is during this time period, one of the major organizations or entity bodies or political body, whatever you want to call it, one of the major power bodies, we'll say, that is going to play a role in this specific time period of the Russian Revolution is the aspect of the Russian army. Mind you, the Russian army was critical in the success of the February to March 1917 revolution that overthrew the Tsar, because once the military units in the capital of Petrograd ended up throwing their support with the revolutionaries and going against the Tsar's orders, that sealed the fate of the Tsar and his monarchy. That pretty much was the end there, once the army actually came across the aisle and joined the revolutionaries, which had not happened in years before. So the provisional government that is just in power, they realized this. They realized that the army was instrumental in the success of the initial revolution, and if they want to continue the democratic change in Russia, they're going to have to somehow maintain the allegiance, or at least try to win the allegiance of the army. You're going to have to maintain the army being with you, because if they go against you and the people go against you, you're going to suffer the same fate as the old imperial regime. So there is already this drive with the provisional government that we must secure the allegiance of the army, but they're not the only political body that is realizing this. As we discussed in the last video, at the same time that the provisional government is being set up by the State Duma, there is another political entity body that is being set up by the middle and lower classes, known as the Petrograd Soviet, which is made up of common factory workers and even to some degree peasants, although peasants were largely left out of this for a large part of it. But this is going to be mostly your common workers. They are part of the Petrograd Soviet, and the Soviet is in a competition with the provisional government because they each claim to represent Russia. Now, the provisional government, of course, is actually getting the recognition of allied nations. They are the ones getting the official international recognition as you are the ruling government of Russia, not this Petrograd Soviet. Even though at home the answer is not so clear. And the Petrograd Soviet, like the provisional government, realizes we also need to try to get the army to go to our side, because if we can get the army on our side, we can have legitimacy here, and we can get rid of the provisional government. So there's already a little bit of a tug of war between the two, and now they're both going for the same target. Who can convince the army to join them first? Now, the Soviet, they also wished to gain the support of them, but they realized that they could not solely rely on the workers if they want to overthrow the provisional government, and that's another reason why they're trying to get them, is they realize not only is the army critical, it's going to be critical to show that we're all of Russia, not just the common worker. because they view the provisional government as the product of the bourgeoisie, the upper rich elite classes. They aren't interested in anything for the common people. So the Petrograd Soviet is struggling for allegiance of the army based on two questions. This is the two questions that the army really has, I think, in most part. What most of the Russian soldiers were worried about is what was the army's new status in this new democratic Russia, in this revolutionary Russia, we'll say, because it's not really fully democratic. But what is the army's new status in this new revolutionary regime? With the imperial government gone, what role are we in? How important are we to the people, to the country? And the second question that's coming on the army's mind is Russia going to continue its war effort? Because there is very mixed opinion. The provisional government is more than in favor of continuing the war effort against Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War I. But the soldiers at the front and people back at home, they're done with the war. They don't want to participate in this anymore. So that's going to be another crucial question that's going to come up is, are we done with this war, or are you going to try to continue it? Now, the Soviet leaders in the Petrograd Soviet, they begin to champion civil rights for soldiers that are in contrast to the Duma, who's appealing to them in the name of national safety. So the Duma is saying, well, you need to maintain your positions and, we need to put our allegiance to us because we can better maintain national security and national safety for our people that way in our country. Where the Petrograd Soviet is saying, well, yes, we're in favor of that too, but we're also going to give you some civil rights if you come to our side. We'll give you some, freedom as individuals in the army that you should deserve. That had kind of been discouraged during the imperial regime. You were expected to follow orders to a T, not ever question them, no matter where they come from. You didn't have much say. The Petrograd Soviet is very much advocating for a little bit of individuality within the army at this point. And that is what they're aiming for. They are hoping that that will be enough to maybe convince most of the army to come to their side. Now, War Minister Guchkov of the initial provisional government, he was prepared to expand civil liberties for soldiers, just like the Soviet was proposing, but he also wanted to make sure it was within military discipline. Basically, if you follow your orders and do what you're told, then we'll talk about granting you those. So his came on a condition, while the Soviets demanded that these should be given unconditionally, that whether or not they follow orders, which they argue they have already proved that they have followed orders through 3 years of warfare, they should be able to get those rights without any further conditions. Now, this turn of events is going to start creeping up because at this point, the Soviet is taking a direct first step toward actually trying to counter the provisional government. They issue the Soviets' publication of Order Number 1. And this Order Number 1 states that soldiers should ignore the provisional government entirely and only follow orders that are coming from the Petrograd Soviet. As they argue, we are the true voice of the people. Don't you listen to the provisional government, whatever they're telling you, you listen to us. This is in direct contrast to the government, to the provisional government that is recognized as the head of Russia right now. It's treason in almost every way. Now, what's going to happen is committee of soldiers are going to be formed in all the naval and military units within the capital and within Petrograd, and the units are subject to their committees and the Soviet. So now the Soviets also we're going to allow, our military soldiers, in order to look more inclusive, we're going to let them be part of the Soviet. Why not? We have factory workers in here. We want to prove we represent Russia, so it's only logical that the army should, in different, regimental units, should have representation in this assembly as well. And they even do the off-duty and noble salutes are abolished. So that was a carryover from the Tsar's days, that when a superior officer walked by, you had to give them this elaborate salute that no matter what your rank was, if they were higher than you had to give. The Soviet issues that this is done. We're not doing this anymore. And you guys now are to form committees, and you are to be a part of this Soviet. Now, the provisional government initially still seemed to win the army's support simply over the need of national security. The army kind of viewed, well, they're preaching national security, so, maybe they have a little bit more use for us right now than the Soviet does. The Soviets just want to get our support, but do they really have a use for us? Now, the provisional government is going to gain that support initially. The army rallied enthusiastically around the provisional government's plan for a more vigorous prosecution of the war, because at first, the armies, the generals at least, they're like, oh, yay, we can get more territory. We can kind of make a strike back. The ordinary soldier is not jumping at the bit for it, but they'll follow their commanders for the time being because it's an uncertain time. Now, what's going to happen is the army is going to initially pledge its allegiance to the Duma and to the revolution. And by pledging its allegiance to the Duma, it's pledging its allegiance to the provisional government. So the question comes, the big question right now is going to be over the continuation of the Russian war effort in World War I. Do we continue or do we withdraw? For continuing the war and commitments to the Allied nations, the provisional government is all for it. But the Petrograd Soviet is very much for make peace without any annexations or only for self-defense. If we continue the war, we're only in favor of doing it if it's for defensive purposes. We're not going for conquering new territory. Now, Foreign Minister Milyukov of the provisional government, he sent a message to allied nations, to like Great Britain and France and the United States, who is now also in the war. He insisted that Russia's war position was unchanged, and this was sent on May 2nd of 1917, insisting that the provisional government did not intend to go back on the former imperial government's word for an upcoming Russian summer offensive that would draw German and Austro-Hungarian forces to the east. He proclaimed that despite the regime change, we are still game, Russia's still a powerful nation, and we're not withdrawing on our commitments to you. Now, Vladimir Lenin, who had arrived in April of 1917, shortly after the Tsar had been overthrown, he decided that we're going to denounce that as evidence of a capitalist imperialist aim. Lenin is very much against the war. He sees World War I as nothing but an imperialist war, and it pretty much was. He sees it as Russia has no business. If we're trying to form a democratic republic, we have no business getting involved or continuing to be involved in this imperialist war. There's no reason to be. So Lenin takes this publicized report that Foreign Minister Milyukov had actively, confirmed with the Allies, we're still going to commit to you in our promises. He took this as evidence that despite the provisional government's claims, they are still an imperialist regime, no better than the Tsar, and they're simply wishing to continue the war for their own benefit, and thus they should be overthrown. Mind you, Lenin is the leader of the Bolsheviks, the communists. Now, War Minister... Oh, hold on here. Show my notes. So this is the situation in May of 1917. Then we're going to come to a critical juncture of that month, involving the joining of the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet into one unified government. Now, leaders of the provisional government slowly came to believe that if they included the Petrograd Soviet, the representatives of that Soviet, if they included them into the provisional government, it would provide a more stable state. It would provide safety for the state. It would kind of silence some of the members in the Soviet a little bit more if they felt they were being included in government decisions. So the offer was made on May 10th of 1917 for the Petrograd Soviet to join the provisional government and form a new coalition government. Initially, the Soviet refused because they viewed, again, the provisional government is the tool of the bourgeoisie. The provisional government is the rich, the elites, the former nobles. They're not interested in the common people's welfare. And so at first, when the offer is first made, the Soviet says, I'm not making a deal with you. I'm not joining you. You're the rich people. You're out to get us. Why would I want to join and form a provisional government with you? They reconsider this after War Minister Guchkov resigns and that kind of brings them around to the table, because Guchkov had been appointed by the Tsar, and he had just inherited the position. So he was a noble. With him gone, they also had a little bit better surprise that, okay, so maybe since he was war minister in charge of, military matters, now we don't have to worry about a rich noble being after imperialist regimes and directing the military. So maybe we could think about joining you now. if some concessions were made. And so on May 18th, 8 days after the initial offer is made, the Petrograd Soviet eventually concedes, and they say, all right, we'll join you. We'll form a coalition. We'll see how it works. So this is going to establish the second provisional government. The first one took power in March upon the Tsar's abdication, and in May of 1917, we have the second one that has been created out of the combination in conjuncture of the old provisional government with a couple resignations and the Petrograd Soviet are now in one government trying to work together on matters. Now, pressing matters are going to immediately test this coalition government that's going to come up. Most pressingly, the upcoming June offensive is going to be a major question over how that's going to be done, because this is basically the planned continuation of the war, and that's going to be a major hot point. The other hot point is going to be the independence movements that are popping up in the former Russian Empire, because as soon as the Tsarist regime fell, multiple independence movements are now starting to take advantage of the chaos in Russia and the weakness of the government and say, this is our chance. We wanted independence for a long time. Grab it now. So instantly, large portions of the Russian Empire, such as Finland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and Poland, are already jumping at the bit to gain their independence. They see this as an opportunity. And they're jumping in this. And there's the question of the provisional government. Are we going to allow these states to break away from the Russian Empire and form their own independent nations? Or are we going to try to retain control of them? Eventually, with regard to the state question, the provisional government never really did anything with the independence movements. They largely kind of let them go their own way. But once the Bolshevik Revolution took place, the Bolsheviks very much tried to reassert control over certain areas. That is part of the reason why Ukraine and Belarus became part of the Soviet Union, is because they were independent for a while, but then during the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks managed to retake control of those two regions and ended up incorporating them into the Soviet Union. However, in the case of Poland and Finland, they gained independence, and the Baltic states as well. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They all gained independence from the Russian Revolution. This brings us to June of 1917, the Kerensky Offensive, as we'll call it, as it's most infamously known. Before we continue, I'll at least show a few things here. We're going to show that map again that we had last week, but this is our heads of the provisional government that has been formed in the wake of the Tsar being abdicated, and they're the ones ruling Russia right now. This is now one half of the government is your provisional heads, who one of them, who is now war minister in the wake of Guchkov resigning, is Alexander Kerensky. This dude. Now, in May of 1917, as we discussed, they joined forces with the Petrograd Soviet, and this is a picture of the inside of a meeting of one of the Petrograd Soviet session, and it just shows you how many people were in this People's Assembly. It wasn't a few, it was quite a bit. So now, this is the other half of the provisional government. And then before we go on too much further, probably critical that we show this, but this again is our map. This is the one we used last week. I want to point out where the Kerensky Offensive is being planned. It's going to be planned for Galicia again, which is where the Brusilov Offensive happened in 1916. That had actually been initially successful. So again, this is now the front line in 1917. This is the pre-war borders. And the Kerensky Offensive is going to happen in Galicia against mostly Austria-Hungary. So that is going to be right here in where this box is. It says Kerensky. This is where the summer of 1917, this is really the last offensive the Russians try in the war, because this leads to a bad outcome, much like it was guessed. So the only reason this offensive came about, as we mentioned, was partly due to the pressure from the other allied nations, that although they were happy that Russia had now gotten rid of the Tsar, ironically, even though they were allies, Britain and France and the United States, they jumped at the enthusiasm that the Tsar was gone, even though he had been an ally, because they had argued, and I'm taking the view from the United States point here, at least. I'm going to share with you the American one. Part of the other reason that the United States have been hesitant to join the Allied nations and get involved in World War I, even though they sympathized with them, part of the reason they still hesitated at first was because of the factor that, President Wilson said that we had to make the world safe for democracy. And it was democracy against, monarchy and tyranny and autocrats. But yet, that kind of ran contradictory because if we join the Allied powers, yes, France is a democracy, Britain is a constitutional monarchy, so it's semi-democratic, it's liberal. Italy is a constitutional democracy, but the one outlier was Russia. Russia was an autocratic monarchy, no different than Austria-Hungary or Germany or even the Ottoman Empire. It was no different than those states. So, to the American viewpoint, how could we say we're fighting to make the world safe from democracy when one of our allies is ruled by an autocrat? So now, in March of 1917, when the Tsar is overthrown, these allied nations are jumping at the bit. This validates their cause. It says, now we are fighting for democracy because now even Russia is now democratic. And this scares the crap out of the Germans, who all along have kind of been hyping up the fear that, oh, if we lose the war, Tsarist Russia is going to take over you and they're going to be much more harsh on you. And the people feared that. Well, now Russia's not ruled by the Tsar. And those governments are having a lot harder time trying to convince their people to fear a Russian invasion. Because they're starting to realize, would it really be that much worse than what I have now, living under an autocratic king or emperor? Because they don't have one now. So that whole aspect plays in. It's kind of weird that, yes, we were allies, but we're also happy that the Tsar's gone and out of power. But the Allied nations continued to put the pressure on the provisional government that you have to maintain the Russian promises that were made to start to launch an offensive in the summer of 1917 to try and draw some of the German and Austro-Hungarian forces away from the West. And this is the only reason that the provisional government even really, I think, considered the matter, is this pressure that was being exerted on them, because in exchange for them launching this offensive, the provisional government is getting all kinds of monetary aid from Britain and France in particular, trying to prop it up. So in exchange for that aid, just keep your word. That's going to help the government, but it's not going to be real good with the common people. Now, the provisional government, they argue that, well, we need to maintain this in the name of national security. But the opponents of this offensive are fearing that it's going to only encourage the Germans to counterattack on a more wide and unholdable front that they don't have the manpower to hold right now, because the army is kind of tedious. We don't know whether or not they're going to last the summer, because we do have people that are launching mutinies. We have deserters. We don't know if this is going to work, and if it don't work, we're going to inevitably get a large counterattack that we might not be able to fend off, because we can't say the army won't disintegrate in the process. Now, Kerensky and the provisional government thought that one of two outcomes was going to occur with this offensive. The first outcome that they thought could happen was that a win would indicate that Russia was still a legitimate threat, and that the Germans would come forward with a separate peace offer in exchange for it, to realize, okay, Russia's not going to be a pushover, even though they had a revolution take place. Maybe we should look into making a separate peace with them and just leave them alone. The second option that he thought could happen was that even if we do lose, it would force German socialists within Germany to defend the Russian Revolution or support German militarism. Because at this point, Russia's not ruled by a czar, so you can't argue that Russia's autocratic. So the socialists have to argue, okay, they've had a revolution like we want to accomplish here in Germany. Do we continue supporting a war effort that seeks to destroy that government, or do we, oppose it? So he thought that was what was going to happen. It would force them in some way to that point. To drum up support for the upcoming offensive, Kerensky even went to the front lines himself and toured the front lines, giving speeches and all kinds of, rallying cries to the soldiers. And when he went to these speeches, the soldiers did applaud him in large numbers, and they pledged that, oh yes, we will go on this offensive. We're going to support the revolution. We support the provisional government. They acted like they loved his speech. But the minute that Kerensky would leave, These same units went back to their barracks and refused to even go into the trenches. It was a show just for why he was there. In reality, they had no intention of going back to the front because they were exhausted and they didn't want nothing to do with it anymore. They wanted to go home. So entire regiments end up being disbanded over their refusal to follow orders even before the offensive has begun. The head of the offensive, Kerensky puts General Alexei Brusilov, the very man that had led the Brusilov offensive that bears his name the year before. Since he had been so successful initially in the year before, it only made sense that we should probably put him in charge of this one. So Kerensky puts General Brusilov in charge, and it's officially launched the Kerensky Offensive on June 18th, 1917. If you're following the more modern calendar, then it would be July 1st. If you're following our calendar nowadays. Now, it did have initial success, like the Brusilov offensive the year before against the Austrians in Galicia, who ended up being, but unfortunately, that initial success rapidly gave out as units were not very organized. They lacked a very, very clear objective of, like, are we taking a specific city? Do we have a certain point that we're going to stop and, let the supply lines catch up? That doesn't happen. And because of that, this initial success ends up turning around and bite the Russians right back because the Germans inevitably launch a massive counterattack in support of their Austrian ally, and it ends up shattering the Russian army. In only 2 weeks, this offensive lasted. Within 2 weeks, the Germans had not only counterattacked and broken the Russian hold on what land they had gained, but they actually made them retreat in mass. Like, they're running scared back into Russia, and multiple units are at this point, it's just mass desertion. They're leaving the battlefield, don't want nothing to do it anymore. The offensive is a crippling failure, and the entire Russian army is pretty much destroyed at this point. There is no concentrated, organized military force of the Russians that is there to now oppose the Germans and the Austrians from just steamrolling into Russia. The army disintegrate. It was already disintegrating, but this finally it broke the Russian army's back. At this point, they had absolutely no desire to hold that ground, and they were not going to stay there and continue doing this blood slog. So it has the bad effect that now the provisional government insisted upon, maintaining this offensive, and now they've just lost the military pretty much. The military is in mass desertion. There are mutinies springing up. There's no, protection force against a German invasion en masse. They've lost the support of the army at that point. The army is again a rogue element. So this brings us to July of 1917, which is going to be a critical point that shows why the provisional government is going to start being hated even more by the people, that is going to allow it to be overthrown here in just a short while. And that brings us to what we call the July Days. Now, while the Kerensky Offensive was disintegrating, the Communist Bolshevik Party back home are making their first bid for power in Petrograd. Vladimir Lenin he had arrived in April from exile in Switzerland, where he had been exiled years before, and he was involved with the Petrograd Soviet. There were Bolsheviks again in the Soviet, but they were not a majority party yet in there. They were a minority. Now, initially, Lenin saw that the Soviet Assembly could kind of act as a recruiting ground for the Bolsheviks and a rallying point for a revolt by the lower classes. Or as he quoted, as the one quote that we have from the revolution is actually pertained to him, all power to the Soviets. He thought, I can kind of find some like-minded people in here that would be more than willing to help us out and get rid of the provisional government. We can rally around it, use it as our main target entity. So initially, Lenin is supportive of it. Later, in May, when the provisional government decides, we're going to go ahead and join with the Petrograd Soviet, and the Petrograd Soviet agrees to do that, Lenin, again, in June, about a month after, he decides, okay, maybe that wasn't such the greatest idea, so I'm going to switch now to a purely Bolshevik revolutionary idea, that the Bolsheviks alone will kind of carry this revolt. We don't need the Petrograd Soviet. They're too in line with the imperialist provisional government. So the plot was created to mobilize the Bolsheviks among the factory workers, as there were Bolsheviks among factory workers, Bolshevik agitators, who would rally the factory workers to kind of revolt, kind of rouse them up, And then they're also going to have the same thing happen in the Petrograd military garrison and the local detachment of Kronstadt sailors, which is the Navy. Now, this upcoming revolt would become known as the July Days, and it only lasted 2 days. The original goal of the revolt was to seize control of the Petrograd Soviet and kind of use that as the main target, but eventually that wasn't entirely communicated to its participants as the main goal, and it kind of fractured. So for 2 days, July 3rd to 4th, or 16th through 17th if you're using ours, of 1917, armed Bolsheviks occupied parts of the capital, parts of Petrograd. They were paralyzed by a lack of coordination and very clear objectives, and the failure of the uprising ended up causing Lenin to disavow any connection to it. The provisional government ended up using the military units within the city to open fire on any rioters and demonstrators, and it led to over 400 people being killed. Now, this is going to take the question of, this is kind of a turning point. Let's think here. 400 people just got killed because the provisional government, in response to the armed revolt, just ordered the army or military units to fire on civilians. This sounds eerily similar to the 1905 revolution and the February Revolution of 1917, where the Tsar had ordered the same thing. So the civilians, until this point, have largely been supportive of the provisional government in some ways. They're really starting to draw a line here and say, okay, you claim to be democratic and good for Russia, but you just fired on us like the Tsar would. So why would we support you when the Bolsheviks are not doing that? So that right there is a turning point that's going to start getting some people thinking as to, is the provisional government really that different than the imperialist regime if they're going to fire on us with guns anytime we don't agree? Now, Kerensky took the immediate opportunity of the failure of the Bolshevik revolt to hurt them by releasing publications of documents which supposedly proved that Lenin was a spy and agent of the German government. Now, which Lenin kind of was. He had been sent back to Russia by the German government to instigate another rebellion, another revolution within the country, to foment chaos and anarchy. So, and he had been given millions of dollars in millions of German marks, which who knows how much money that is. I could pull up the statistic, but the point is the German government is not only sending Lenin back, they're also funding him with money to buy, print publications, to buy weapons, to get support. They're funding him and send him back. So in a way, he is a German agent, and Kerensky had evidence that kind of implicated this, and he made it clear to the Russian people, this guy cannot be trusted. He's working for the enemy. And this leads to a suppression of the Bolsheviks and an arrest of many of the Bolshevik leaders who are now kind of seen as pro-German traitors to Russia. It kind of works against Lenin. Lenin himself actually flees to Finland to escape the rioting mobs that come after the Bolsheviks. However, some of his fellow comrades, most notably ones like Leon Trotsky and Lev Kamenev and Anatoly Lunacharsky, end up being jailed. They end up being captured in jail. And the office of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, which also would later become the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they ended up having their office raided and all the printing presses destroyed by the mob as a retaliatory for this implication that Lenin was somehow working for the Germans, that this was not truly a Russian revolution. The Bolsheviks are traitors to the provisional government and to the common people, which in a way they were. This here, good to show these now. This is an image of, during the July days, of a crowd being opened fire on with machine guns. And you can see some people are already lying on the ground. I can't tell if they're dead or if they're taking cover. But this was a street during the July days in Petrograd where you can see people are running because the military units somewhere up here that had been sent with orders from the provisional government are now opening fire with machine guns on the crowd to disperse them. Mind you, these are Bolshevik supporters or people that have been riled up by Bolshevik agitators, but they still didn't deserve that. This, of course, is probably a very familiar face of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin, who we're definitely going to see a lot more of here in the next 2 videos. He is the leader of the Bolsheviks. He's going to be one of the first leaders of the Soviet Union. So he's going to be very critical. He's the one that orchestrated the whole plot, but then as soon as it failed, he said, "Oh, I didn't have nothing to do with that. I didn't do that. The people were not being fooled." And then one of his, basically, this Leon Trotsky, who's also going to form a big role in the Bolshevik Revolution and Russian Civil War, he was kind of Lenin's like second-hand man. He was like his second in command to some extent, and he ended up actually being captured and jailed because of the July Days. Yeah, he looks like a dashing figure. So that leads us to after the July Days, Kerensky seized the opportunity to kind of get more power for himself and the provisional government solidified because he realized that, okay, we just won a major victory here over the Bolsheviks. They're being suppressed. The people are turning against them a little bit. This is a win. We can try to solidify our regime a little bit more. So he seizes the opportunity after the July Days, after this failed revolt, to put himself in the candidacy for premiership of the provisional government, war minister, as well. Now, Prince Lvov, the one noble who has joined the provisional government and then been there from the beginning, he ends up resigning after being given an ultimatum by the government's Soviet members that asked him to, well, demanded of him in this case, to A, declare Russia a republic, and B, suppress the Duma, and as a last one, they wanted him to forbid the sale of any land without government approval. Lvov would not actually agree to this, so he ended up resigning. So, in the wake of his resignation, Kerensky was named Prime Minister of the Provisional Government while also being given the position of War Minister of the reconstructed government. The government under Kerensky lacked any kind of vigor and they were very inactive. They really didn't accomplish hardly anything. They were weak, which only is going to cause the people to kind of less and less support the provisional government because they see them as a weak institution that can't really protect them or do anything for them. They failed to unite any of the various political factions within the country, and they gave very little attention to the agrarian policy of the country. Mind you, the peasants, who are the lowest class of Russia and also the largest, they're kind of being just forgotten. They're left to their own devices to settle matters. The government's not even really helping them. The only real achievements that Kerensky's provisional government was able to get was the declaration that Russia was a republic and the establishment of a state assembly in Moscow that would hopefully represent all the classes and political groups within Russia. However, this also failed ultimately in its end game because none of the groups would really unify and work together, even though they were in this chamber. So this failed to garner any support for Kerensky's administration. He was just kind of seen as a doting, like a figurehead. Yes, he's prime minister, but what is he really doing? He's not getting nothing done. So the failings of the Kerensky administration ended up to govern the country effectively, and the disorganization of the army are going to encourage some military leaders to start thinking about, maybe we should seize power here. So this establishes the first thoughts of establishing a military dictatorship over Russia. Initially, and this is quite surprising that I found out, Kerensky was actually in favor initially of establishing a military dictatorship, as he thought it would bring some sort of stability. And he actually supported the commander-in-chief, General Levar Kornilov, into his plan to do this. However, Kerensky ended up retracting that support when he realized that Kornilov himself was the one that planned to he wanted to become dictator, and the whole plan centered around putting himself in power. And that's when Kerensky said, okay, I didn't sign on to this, so yeah, I'm not going for this anymore. So after that, he deduces Kornilov's revolt plans, and he ends up declaring Kornilov is a traitor to an enemy to the revolution. In response, Kornilov kind of plays his hand and sends Cossack cavalry regiments to the capital under General Krimov to Petrograd to intimidate the provisional government and kind of keep them silent while he gets ready to launch this major coup. Kerensky then turned to the left, knowing that he lost the army at this point. He's turning to the left for support, the Soviet. He's asking them to help me at this point because you guys are the only ones that can help me. Because at this point, the army's going to go behind Kornilov. The Soviet appealed to the workers in Petrograd to fight against the counter-revolution. They said, this guy is a threat. He's going to threaten everything that we're working on right now. He cannot be allowed, the military cannot be allowed to take control. Surprisingly, this worked. It did rile up the workers in Petrograd to support the provisional government against the military revolt, and the Bolshevik leaders ended up being released from prison, and they also surprisingly joined in support of this, fighting this counter-revolution that was about to be launched by the military. No battle ended up taking place because deputies from the Soviet ended up being sent to meet with the Cossack cavalry regiments, and they managed to convince them that they had been following false orders and to turn back, which foiled Kornilov's whole revolt. In response to the military units no longer being present at the capital to intimidate them, Kerensky had no problem sending people to go and arrest Kornilov and three of his generals, and Kornilov and those three were all imprisoned for their failed revolt against the provisional government. With the exception of General Krimov, who had been the one in charge of the cavalry regiment sent to the capital, as he actually ended up shooting himself. This revolt is going to mark the last major stage here that is going to weaken support from the provisional government, because now people see it as even weaker. They realize the army is no longer with Kerensky, and he had to ask his opponents, the left, to really come with him and stop this from actually succeeding. So they now view, okay, Kerensky's really weak. He's not doing anything for us. He can't do anything for us. The provisional government is weak. So maybe we should be looking toward other options, such as the ones that the Bolsheviks are preaching that they can deliver if they're given power, which is going to lead into October and November of 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. And then I think the last one we have here, if I can find it, this is a portrait of the general that led that revolt against the provisional government. This is General Kornilov. He was actually from Turkestan, so that's why he doesn't look entirely like a normal Russian. He kind of looks a little bit of an Asian ethnicity, a little bit, is because he was from Turkestan. So he actually was from Asia, which is quite surprising that he got to that level of commandantship in the Russian Empire, because I didn't think they were that open to non-Russian ethnicities getting that high of a rank, because back then they definitely had some racism going on. But he was the one that led the revolt, and he ended up being imprisoned. I think about a year later, he ended up being killed in the fighting that ensued with their civil war, but that was the major role that he played. So that concludes this little video for the summer of 1917, and I hope that just kind of shows a little bit of what's going on in Russia after the February Revolution, and how it's kind of leading to show that the provisional government is not up to the task of governing the country. Russia is it's still in chaos. The army is disintegrated at this point. The army itself, some military units are now at the point that they just tried to stage a revolt to seize power for themselves. It's just utter chaos. So this is going to leave a wide window open for the Bolsheviks to try to gain the people's allegiance and launch their own revolution in just a few months. So that concludes for today. So that fills all that in. So next week, we will be covering the Bolshevik Revolution, which is where the Bolsheviks and the Communists finally seize power, and we'll go over how that happens and the eventual peace that they actually make to pull Russia out of the war. So that will be next week. So that should be all for this week. So as usual, any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. I will make sure that I put the link to the previous video at the end of this in case you haven't watched that one over the February-March Revolution. That way people can go back and watch that if they haven't. But yeah, we are moving along with this. I know we'll have one more video after the Bolshevik one. We'll cover the Russian Civil War, and then we'll see where we are. So hopefully everyone has a good Thanksgiving and a good rest of their week, and we'll see you back here next week for the Bolshevik Revolution, where Lenin is finally going to get his heyday. So until next week, we'll see you then.